In May 2006, I failed a lie detector test that I had tried to cheat my way through. And after failing, I contemplated for a few brief seconds suicide because there was this looming reality that federal prison was going to be a part of my future. And I never shared it with anyone because I was so embarrassed and ashamed to acknowledge that I could even think that. I even get chills thinking about it going back all of these years. And to help others going through this experience manage suicidal thoughts, preventative techniques, if you're having these concerns as I once did, it's a privilege and a wonderful opportunity to invite a friend of mine, Paul Bertrand, to our channel. Paul will get into his story as a retired FBI agent, but I will tell you personally, Paul is the FBI agent that worked my case, who showed up at my home so many years ago and gave me opportunities to do the right thing. But due to shock and rage and denial, embarrassment, I made a series of bad choices that made it harder on those that love and support me. So if you are enduring this criminal justice system, we want to help. If you're just someone struggling with mental health issues, we want to help. With that said, Paul, we're so grateful that you're taking the time to share some of your wisdom to our subscribers at White Collar Advice. And before we get into the specific details of suicide and suicide prevention, everyone watching would love to learn a little bit more about you and your background.
Sure. Thanks very much, Justin, for having me. Again, my name's Paul, and I was an FBI agent for 21 years, and then I went back to the academy and taught for two more. So I spent 23 years altogether from 1998 until last summer, 2021. And how I got into suicide prevention came after I was a street agent and after I was a squad supervisor. I took a job in 2015 where I was a regional program manager for the Employee Assistance Program for the FBI. And what that means, the Employee Assistance Program is the program that's responsible for the mental health and well-being of FBI employees. There's 35,000 of them nationwide. And so I ran that program for the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. And that dealt with everything from the day-to-day stresses and mental health concerns to crisis intervention program. We would respond to any mass casualty events or disasters of any type that FBI employees were exposed to that we knew could be considered traumatic experiences for them. It also involved the chaplain program, among other things, and it involved the suicide prevention program. For a couple of years, I ran the suicide prevention program for the FBI. And what I discovered, in the job is that kind of like a lot of places, suicide prevention in the FBI centered around awareness. It's centered around posters on the wall that said, if you need help, here's places to get help. And centered around emails from executives encouraging people if they need help to reach out for help, and that sort of thing. What you might call regular suicide prevention efforts. But what was missing was any sort of skills, how to actually do suicide prevention. And so one of our employee assistance counselors in our New York office invited me to a 2-day suicide intervention class called ASSIST, Applied Suicide Intervention Strategies Training. And through that training, I loved it. First of all, it was very well done. Used all the principles of adult education, and it was very much activity based, interactive, role playing, scenario based. And I came out of it being very, very confident that I had the skills then to actually talk to people who were contemplating suicide and come up with a plan to keep them safe. And so I thought that would be good for the entire FBI, not just me. From the point of view of the FBI, of course, FBI employees contemplate suicide, just like any law enforcement. But also, the agents, there's probably 14,000 agents, and they all talk to victims of crime, witnesses of crime, and subjects of investigations on a regular basis. And it's not at all uncommon that those people might be considering suicide. And of course, visits from the FBI and involvement with the FBI usually doesn't help that very much. In fact, I don't really think there's many agents out there at all who haven't known of some defendants, whether it's their own or those of other agents who have killed themselves, even before sentencing, a lot of times, just when that fear of the unknown overcomes them. And so I thought it would be good to train FBI employees specifically in suicide intervention that we did not get, going through the academy or that. And so I ended up convincing the powers that be to fund the program, and ended up training 16 assist trainers and 20 trainers in another program called Safe Talk. And to date, more than 3,000 FBI employees have been trained in suicide intervention. And the beauty of it is that, people can talk about suicide all day long, but if they're lacking the skills to actually have the conversation and rehearse the conversation and know what to do when someone starts talking about suicide, it becomes a panic situation and everybody wants to avoid it. And it's kind of, not that it's too late at that point, but it sure is nice to know just how we know how to do anything, to know what to do if somebody starts talking about suicide. And so that's a little of my background, and that's how I got involved in suicide prevention.
So I'd like to break down a handful of things you said and transition into a question. Our team has worked with a number of defendants over the last 13 years, and unfortunately, a handful of our clients have chosen to take their own life. And in every case, they hadn't been sentenced yet. And it was that waiting and wondering, the pain and shame that accompanied it. Just couldn't envision some future without duress and heartache for everyone that loves and support them, and victims they had created. But part of the issue is, in my case, in many cases, we don't view ourselves as criminals. We view ourselves as law-abiding citizens. Many people frequently say, including me, you worked my case, you saw the denial, the shame, the lying. Didn't work openly with my lawyer. We'll talk into that. But I said I didn't have bad intentions. I didn't end up here. It was an aggressive corporate culture. Others were to blame. So when you showed up at my home, or you show up at a defendant's home, there's this whole panoply of emotions: shock, rage, denial, embarrassment, and people begin to spin out of control, especially some who have never endured adversity. And as you know, in my case, I had never had any adversity in my life. I didn't know how to respond. Can you offer some advice for a defendant when an agent shows up at the home, how to handle some of those initial feelings and the early days and weeks, and what you saw, and some advice you would give to someone once they learn they're the subject of a government investigation?
Sure. We agents know that it can be stressful for those subjects, and it's interesting. It happened to me after one particular meeting. This guy had lied to me when I originally visited him, and he sent me on a wild goose chase for about a year. And before I was ready to go back and see him again, and when I went back to see him again, he did come clean, because I presented him with evidence that was just overwhelming, and so he came clean. But he became, pretty distraught, pretty much a mess. And after we were done, he had taken responsibility for what he did. He signed a statement. He basically had come clean. And I was getting out to the car, and my partner I was with is looking at me, and he's like, "What the heck are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean? I'm getting in the car." And he's like, no, you can't leave. Get back in there and convince that guy not to kill himself as soon as we leave. And that's when the first time I went in and actually had a talk with a defendant of mine about, listen, this is the first day of the rest of your life. It's not the last day of this part of your life. And so I want you to look forward, and here's all the stuff that you can expect to come. And I kind of just stepped through it with him right there, all the next steps, how everything was going to work. And from that point forward, it, that kind of became a little more of a habit. And from that point forward, it's kind of as if we're marching through the thing together. So it wasn't nearly as isolating, as it could have been, if we'd have just gotten in the car and left.
It's important for defendants to do is embrace the reality of the situation. You have to work openly with your lawyer. You have to accept responsibility if you broke the law. But sometimes for some, the reality of the looming situation is just so much to bear because of all the collateral consequences that accompany a criminal conviction. Embarrassment, shame potentially, career, licensing, loss of freedom. Some defendants seem to embrace or make matters worse. And in advance of this interview, I listened to a podcast that you gave that was very insightful. And in that, you said something akin to people who have suicidal thoughts think they are losing control of everything in their lives. And as we know, when you feel helpless, it's just hard to function, get out of bed or brush your teeth. So I'd like you to talk to the helplessness. It's not really true. There are still things that you can control, but it is very common for a defendant to feel just utterly incapable of doing anything and seeing any future without some sort of pain at times. I'd like you to discuss that if you would.
Yeah, I like the word you used, control. That's an important word. People, when they feel like they've lost control of their own life, can tend to have a lot more suicidal feelings than people who haven't. And in particular, what I've noticed in talking to people and through experience is the fear of the unknown is everything. And the fear of the unknown seems to be worse in almost every case than the actual reality of the unknown is. Like, for instance, the actual pain of everything to come, I think, isn't nearly as bad as people presume it's going to be before it happens. The actual experience, I think, isn't nearly as bad as people presume it's going to be before it happens. And so it's when people get caught up in that loop of not being able to think of anything else besides what bad thing's going to happen, and it just spins around in their head. They find themselves unable to sleep at night. They find themselves unable to eat, maybe lose a bunch of weight. They find themselves distant even with the people that they're close with, in that they're always preoccupied or thinking about something else. And it's during that time where that same unknown is just spiraling in their head. And people have trouble living like that for very long. There's a lot of research that's been done that says, like, a loss of belongingness and a perceived burdenness really contribute to suicide. And so if you can imagine someone who's facing charges and obviously isn't used to that, they may be losing their entire identity in their mind and the belongingness to everything that they used to belong to. And that's a big deal. And if we add to that, like, oh no, how am I going to take care of my family now? They'd be better off without me. That starts to play towards that perceived burdensomeness.
Well, it's
And
interesting. When I visited the CDC website, and the statistics on suicide are the amount that try and actually do it every 11 minutes. I read someone takes their own life. The numbers are staggering. You go through the list of symptoms: loss of career or freedom, stress, divorce, depression. All of these can accompany a criminal conviction, and it can just really put people on heightened alert when struggle comes. This leads to: do you think people could be more predisposed to contemplate suicide? Is it? I thought about it for just a few seconds, and I kind of gave myself a slap in the face and said never again. And thankfully, I didn't. Though, as we know, some think, act, and unfortunately take their own life. In your experience, are some people more predisposed, to do it? Walk us through the kind of candidate and those who actually go from thought to action.
Mm. That's interesting, and I'm not sure I'm going to have a satisfactory answer for you there. But I will say this: I think thoughts of suicide are incredibly common, much more common than we give them credit for. The actual number says that in any population, like 1 in 20 people will contemplate suicide in any given time period, any given 2 week period. And 1 in 20 doesn't sound like that many, but like I use the example of the FBI kind of often. There's 36,000 people in the FBI, and so if simply 1 out of 20 are contemplating suicide at any given time, that's 1,800 people, right? And so if just being part of being human is 1,800 people in that population thinking about suicide at any given time, when you add to that all of life's stressors, Justin, I say this kind of often to people. Everybody that is thinking of suicide used to be somebody that wasn't thinking of suicide. And it's not that profound, except if you stop to realize the only thing that happened is issues built up to the point where the pressure got great enough where they finally said, man, maybe it would be easier if I just didn't wake up in the morning, right? And that's that first thought of suicide. And so what really changed from the moment before until that moment? But we all have we all are human, we all have thoughts, and so I think a lot of people are being pretty disingenuous when they talk about not having had thoughts of suicide. In fact, I think part of the whole goal in getting past this, if you want to call it a pandemic of suicide, is normalizing the thoughts to the point where it's really not that big of a deal. Now, you touched on going from thoughts to action, and there's a lot of research that's been done there, and a lot, the desire people have to live is very strong. In fact, it's probably people's greatest desire. Like people will actively try to not be in dangerous situations. And so to overcome that, it does take some circumstances or some work. And so, like, there is basically a whole school of thought that says that people have to learn through either traumatic experiences or through past suicide attempts or through some kind of events in their life to be able to overcome that desire to live, which is so strong. And then it's only that combined with all of those other factors we mentioned: loss of identity, loss of belonging, feeling a burden, all the rest, that cause somebody to start doing those or do more and more lethal suicide behaviors.
Many years ago, someone called. They were home from prison for many years, and they watched a video our team filmed something like, don't let a short prison sentence become a life sentence. And the analogy was, if you get a year and a day, just serve a year and a day. Don't suffer for the rest of your life. And this former executive was continuing to struggle with employment, depression, divorce. Even his prison term was well behind him. And he's like, why don't I just take this, borrow a gun from a friend? Because, of course, I can no longer have a gun because I'm a convicted felon. Why just borrow a gun and kill myself? And to the extent that I could help, I tried to help, but I was newly married at the time. And I remember telling my wife, like, I just hope I didn't make matters worse. I didn't know what to say. Like, so I think there may be people watching who may feel as if their loved ones are thinking these things, but also they may be thinking, like, I don't want to make matters, I don't want to offer platitudes and happy talk. It's going to be okay. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's what I heard when I was a defendant. It's going to be okay. We love you and support you. And it's like, that's why I'm not coming to July 4th. I'm going to sit in my home in isolation with the shutters down and just think about how I got here. People tried to help. How can people help if they fear someone they love or care for is giving real thoughts of suicide? We just don't want to make matters worse.
A couple different answers. It's funny. I would like to interview you because because here's my first answer to that. Um, Well-being takes work, and well-being takes activity, and it takes the exact opposite of pulling your shutters and sitting inside and being depressed and wallowing in your sorrows. Um, and so, like, if I could ask you a question,
Mm-hmm.
it would be that it's obvious to me that you found well-being even in prison. And so how did you do it?
I had a mentor, as you know, Michael Santos, who was serving a 45-year prison sentence. And when I surrendered, I did what some defendants do, which is blame and excuse my conduct, blame my co defendant, my co conspirator, my partner who I thought should have been indicted, UBS, everyone but myself. And through a very difficult questioning, he helped me understand the value of introspection and thinking about the real motivations that led me here. And he encouraged me to find a level of perspective. In other words, learning from people who had it worse, whether it's Viktor Frankl, someone who saw his family summarily get executed in the concentration camps, or Mandela served 27 years wrongfully convicted, or Michael serving 45 years for a nonviolent drug crime. And through that analysis and introspection, I began to feel a sense of gratitude for what remained rather than obsess over all that I had lost. And those
Mhm.
thoughts began to carry me through my journey. And I'm grateful that I had a mentor that helped get me there. And I fear without that, I'd have spent my prison term lamenting over the injustice that I thought was my life. And it all it that was the transformation for me.
Yeah, and what a great answer, right? And so you brought up Viktor Frankl, and he's all about meaning and purpose, obviously. And so if I had to argue as an observer, I would say that you found meaning and purpose um, through the thought that you could be helping others to, have different experiences that you had, right? Because the whole definition of meaning and purpose is serving and belonging to something bigger than yourself. And another part of that well-being that you brought up is that relationship with Michael, right? And positive relationships is a huge part of well-being. And of course, the only way to have positive relationships is to be willing to be in a positive relationship and do your part, right? Another part of well-being, is engagement, and that ability to get wrapped up in something to the point where you lose track of time, right? And I would argue that you probably did a lot of that starting in prison and continuing afterwards, um, getting wrapped up in your work to the point where it's not even work, where you just lose time. And the same thing, goes for accomplishments. You mentioned gratitude and positive emotion, and that whole idea of counting your blessings. When you do those things, you focus outward and you focus on others. You don't focus inward. And an inward focus and a focus on self, I think if there is a devil, that's probably it. Um, And so now if you look at defendants who don't do so well, um, combined with their fear of losing everything and the fear of unknown of what's to come, if they're too embarrassed and they lose all their positive relationships because they've lost whatever it is they were doing before, the charges, and if they've lost their engagement, which is whatever they were working on all that time, and now that's gone, and they've lost whatever their meaning and purpose was, and they're hiding inside with the blinds pulled, um, and of course they've lost all those positive emotions. I mean, even stuff like awe and admiring, what's out there in nature, and all of those require looking out, not looking in. But if you're fixated in your own mind, spiraling around it, the reason I bring this up is because, like depression and all the rest, that's the bad stuff. But even if you remove the bad stuff, if you consider it like a number line, -10 to +10, even if you remove all that bad stuff, you're at zero, emptiness. That well-being part is that whole uh, 0 to +10 part, and so there's really two prongs to this. One sure is remove the bad, but two is add the good. I'm gonna shut up now just to ask if there's anything you want to say,
Yeah,
because
I I want to. I'd love for you to tell. I'd love for you to mention after you say it. I'm going to have a follow up question because it relates to defendants and the answer will help defendants going through this system. And I'm going to. I'd like to say something, then revert back to something you said in that very insightful podcast you did with your colleague. When you interviewed me, can you walk the audience through that interview and what you said following that interview? And then after you say it, I'll then have my question for you. Yeah, I'm vulnerable. I put my whole life out there. I want people to learn from the bad decisions our team has made. We want to help people get through this with dignity, with a plan. We want them to do better than us. We don't want this to be a life sentence for them. I did so many things poorly that exacerbated my struggles from start to finish. And we want people to do better. So we're going back, what are we, in 2022? This was in May of 2005, a long time ago. So I would
Yeah.
just feel free to offer some thoughts on that, and then I'll have a follow
um
up.
sure. And I think truth be told, you probably remember that interview a lot better than I
Yes,
do.
the specific thoughts about the lawyer and preparation I think are key, and that we can discuss then.
Yeah. And I was kind of depressed when I left there, because like I've told you,
When you left the interview with me.
when I left the interview, yeah, because like I've told you before, I mean, holy cow, I mean, I'm sitting there with your emails in my hand, like I know what you knew and what you didn't know, and and I was actually expecting to get some help from your attorney. Like, I was expecting that when you started lying, he would just reach over and smack you in the head and tell you don't do that. And that didn't happen. And so, you know, uh, basically, when agents are investigating cases, they just want the crime to be over and end and move on to something else. Like, sure, people get charged with stuff, and some people got to go to jail. That's part of it, but that's the consequence that follows from the behavior. But when when the agents are doing interviews, they're just trying to piece together the case of what happened and get to the bottom of it so it's solved as quick and painlessly as possible. And and so I just remember having great hope that we were just going to put a case to bed that day, wrap up all the loose ends, see if there's anybody else that need to be investigated, and kind of just the opposite happened. It's like, oh crap. So now, this guy's not going to cooperate. He's going to decide to lie and fight instead. So now we got to go, continue to work the case for another year and blah, blah, blah.
So that leans into something I heard you say, which I thought was very profound. You said no one wants to die; they just want the pain to end. I
Mm-hmm.
lied in part because I thought you'd believe it. Therefore, it would lead to what I wanted, the pain to end. But in so doing, lied. I simply made matters worse for everyone that loves and supports me. So everyone wants the pain to end. So I want you to discuss if you show up, if an investigation begins and 95% of the work is done, and you're going to hand it to U.S. attorney, there is going to be pain. The question is how much pain. So if you know someone's broken the law, or I should say the defendant knows, and they want the pain to end. As you said, no one wants to die. They want the pain to end. Can you offer some insights for a defendant watching how they can get the pain to end more quickly?
Yeah, I am not a lawyer by any means, but I think I've told you before, I'm always very proud of people when they just accept responsibility for what they've done and decide to change their life at that moment and move forward.
You sent me a letter when I came home from prison before you invited me to speak at the academy, and you said, I'd like you to know that I'm proud of you. I'll never forget that.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean it. I've spoken at some law schools before, and speaking at those law schools, sometimes we get questions from the law students. The law students always think that agents are violating everybody's rights when they talk to them. And I mean, I guess they're studying to be lawyers, so of course they want to be present for everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I always have to stop those law students and tell them, look, we're not out there to violate people's rights. We're not out there to make people say things they otherwise shouldn't. We're out there to put an end to the crime that's happening. We're out there to get the truth of what's happening, and we're genuinely like proud when people take um, take responsibility for what they did and decide to turn their life around right there. And I mean, it's important that if people have the chance, I would never tell anybody that's not guilty to say that they are, but for people that know that they've done the thing, that fear of the unknown is going to end up being much more devastating than simply facing the consequences ever would be and cooperating right from the get-go.
That's right. What I learned, and had I had this information prior to our interview, if I wanted the pain to end, which is what I wanted, it would have included working openly with my lawyer, accepting responsibility, focusing not on how Justin's life was imploding, but rather the victims, investors turned victims as a result of my conduct. I didn't think about them or the stakeholders or how the prosecutor or government viewed me, but rather it was all about me. And of course, that just exacerbated my struggles. I've had people ask a family member of a client who passed away, who was a physician, before sentencing. The daughter was adamant. She said, I don't think we could have done anything. Maybe that's a cop out. It's making me feel better. I don't think we could have done anything. Do you think are there some instances where you just cannot help someone? And in that case, how can you help the family? What are some resources and things the family can do if someone is just not in a position to be helped?
Um, some folks make a decision, and once the person's made the decision, it might be significantly harder to have them not die by suicide. Um, Prior to that, I think that families can get training to learn how to recognize when thoughts of suicide might be present and how to have those conversations. Um, that's important. but then afterwards, suicide's an interesting thing in that, unlike in a regular death, people sometimes don't even get to grieve properly because of the suicide. Um, they don't know if they should mention details of how the person died, even when they're talking about it. They don't know sometimes if it's right to have a funeral or not. Um, they don't know. There's all these unknowns, and so the time to learn all of this, unfortunately, isn't after the suicide happens, right? But there are you know people out there, ministers of every different faith, what have you, that are educated and understand suicide and are prepared to help with services for suicides. There are groups and therapies and the rest for people that are survivors of suicide who can talk with other people who are going through the same thing and who have been through it before. Um, that can help, but the it's interesting. All of these things we're talking about would qualify as postvention, right? If there's prevention, intervention, and postvention. Postvention is what happens after a suicide, and good postvention is in fact prevention for the next generation. It's interesting in my line of work, a whole bunch of people I know in my line of work are people whose family members have suicided in the past, and it's interesting that after that, these people get all the training and then make it one of their life's missions to train others what to do so the same thing doesn't happen to them. Um, but the, this suicide's not going to go away. The pain's not going to go away. Time does help, and so does all of these things I'm talking about.
If someone is an alcoholic, for example, can go to AA as an
Mhm.
example. Are there support groups? In other words, if someone's watching this right now, if me, right, that someone who had a lot of things had gone their way, just like that, they see their name versus the United States of America. Wow, everything is beginning to implode. Very difficult to imagine some future without heartache. While someone drinking can go to AA, as I just mentioned, if someone like me is watching this, what do they do next? You discuss the importance of well-being and prioritizing your health. Are there support
Yeah.
groups? I suppose they can go see a counselor, but not everyone has the means or insurance to potentially pay a couple hundred or $300 an hour for a counselor. I'd like someone watching to know what's a good action step to take. Can you offer a
Okay.
few potential scenarios what to do?
Sure. Remember, it's back to two halves. One is stop the pain,
Yep.
remove the misery. You can talk to a counselor all day long, but if you haven't taken responsibility for your behavior yet, and you're still stuck out there on that island facing this massive steamroller coming at you, the misery is going to stay. So I would say from a few different points of view. One is remove as much misery as you can by working with people that actually know the system, that can guide you to what's the quickest way to end the pain. The next is, if possible, yes, start getting that therapy, that counseling, that rest of it. Again, for that removing the pain part, removing the misery. But then the other half is that building the well-being, and so that's going to mean actually opening the door and going out and not hiding inside with the shutters, even if you don't feel like it. It's going to be doing the action, and hoping that the result follows.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's I would say three prongs right there. First, remove the actual real case misery as far as possible. Second, remove the mental health misery. And third, build the well-being. Actually do things that provide you with new meaning and purpose and a reason to go and be part. Do things that provide you with new positive relationships that are contributing and building and important. Do things that get you engaged and useful, all of that. And I think all of that together creates a situation where it's much less miserable.
Something that I have done, some of our clients do, or anyone watching should consider it. So I tended, when I was a defendant, I was a smoker for a while, and I said, well, the smoking is going to help me get through the stress, and I associated smoking with less stress. But in the end, I just felt worse. I just smelled poorly. My heart was racing fast. I was unathletic. I was chubby. I was fat. It would lead to eating poorly. So a little ways before I went to prison, I had some help with my best friend Brad Fulmer, who was an athlete and really understood the importance of health and fitness. He suggested that I just remove things from the home that could lead to these bad habits. So he said, just don't keep any cigarettes in the home. And if they weren't there, I didn't smoke. And simply removing things. I try to do that exercise now, even with my family. If there's cookies in the home, they're gone. Don't keep them there. I still lack discipline at times. But I mention this because in reading the CDC website, people who have guns or people who drink or have substance abuse issues can contribute to thinking and actually acting on suicide. So perhaps something as simple as just getting rid of it can potentially lower the chances. I know when you leave the home, the cigarettes can be at a 7-Eleven, but to the extent that you can improve your chances and begin to live without things you think you need, I began to do that. Some of our clients begin to do that, and it helps them develop in better habits, because then when you get a stressful call from your lawyer, in the past, if that pack of cigarettes is right there, you'd smoke, but if it's not, you need to find another outlet. So, does alcohol, drinking, some of these things potentially contribute to having, people having some thoughts of suicide?
um I don't know if they contribute to people having thoughts. I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I would say that they make it a lot easier to act on those thoughts. And and so that, like even when you're doing a suicide intervention, coming up with a safety plan, alcohol and drugs can make that plan go bad really quickly. Like people are a lot more apt to just say, to heck with it, after they've been drinking. And so clearly, I'm not saying abstain from, alcohol or whatever, but definitely if you can avoid that intoxication, that's way better. And the same thing, you know, did you mention a minute ago, if you can figure out how to get alcoholics just not to buy vodka anymore, or if you can figure out how to get smokers not to bring cigarettes in their house anymore, I mean, you should write a book and be a zillionaire, because like I've had that conversation with so many people, so many alcoholics, that like for me it's just obvious, like, switch to beer. If if you're drinking vodka every day, just don't go to the store and just don't buy vodka anymore. Just don't bring it in your house. Like there's no way you could drink that much beer, you know, and yet they won't do it. They'll say, "Oh yeah, I'm trying," and still, and so yes, of course, that advice you're given is great advice. And if you have that kind of a relationship where people trust you enough to actually listen to you and simply remove the cookies from the house, then keep spreading that word, because
Well, I'll,
absolutely.
I'll tell you what some of our clients have learned over the years in so doing. They then begin to delay gratification, not smoking or drinking. then you begin to find some positives from the experience. Like, okay, I'm indicted. That sucks. I may go to prison. That's awful. But I'm becoming introspective and I'm thinking about how I got here. Maybe my children will be better for this someday. Or I'm not going to do what Justin did, which was eat like a glutton day in and day out. Like every day I ate like I had a date with the electric chair because I thought life is over because I'm going to prison. You can improve your fitness. You can walk 2 or 3 miles. We have clients, we use the Strava app. We're not paid to use Strava, but I have 10 or 15 clients who say, I'm just going to walk a mile or two a day and track the miles. And at the end of the month, they have 60 miles on this app. And now they're inspired to do 100. So you can become competitive and you can find a way to find some benefits through this experience and not let it amount to a life sentence. These are lessons I wish I had learned when I contemplated suicide after failing that lie detector test I cheated through. And I want to close with something you mentioned in a podcast that I thought was very profound. And I hope we can do a number of videos, but I'd like to conclude with this one. In the podcast, you mentioned something like a team member listened to the podcast and said, this is such a powerful message. I'd really be grateful if you would discuss it with Mr. Bertrand. Is the idea that there is a long road between thoughts of suicide and someone who actually commits suicide. Given the fact that very few will ever get to the actual tragic end of the road, the real benefit of helping someone in this area is not just to keep them alive, but to get them emotionally healthy so they can be productive. I know you spoke to well-being. I think it's worth addressing again now, someone who's thinking it, to not going down that road to actually doing it. I'd love to have you address that one more time in this final question.
You know, I would say this, especially if like family members are watching. Once you've talked about thoughts of suicide with somebody, I would venture to say that there's nothing you can't talk about with them.
I love that. Yeah, that's yeah.
And do you know? Oh, Justin, it's funny. I haven't told you this before, but I've used this line so many times that suicide intervention is just like being an FBI agent. In that when you're an FBI agent interviewing a subject, you're trying to get that person to open up to you and tell you their deepest, darkest secret that they've never told anybody else and that they probably wouldn't even share with their own spouse. And so how are you as a stranger, as an FBI agent, supposed to get a stranger to do this in one conversation? You know? And suicide intervention is really the same. People don't advertise that they're having thoughts of suicide. It's the deepest, darkest secret. And you're trying to get a person to trust you enough to open up and tell you their deepest, darkest secret that they might not even tell their spouse, and allow you in to help them, right? And so, especially for families, although for you, working with people you work with, if you have an opportunity to build connection and trust ahead of time, do it, because then you can get through all the building connection and trust part when it comes time to talking about serious things like suicide. And simply by building connection and trust, you're really greatly influencing a person's chances of ever dying by suicide. Because people who have connection and trust and belonging and all the rest aren't typically the people that are doing the suicide behaviors. And so, I don't know where I'm going with this.
It's an important. There's so much more that we can cover. It's so valuable hearing from you because you were in the trenches for so long and you come from a different perspective and you see it differently. I'll tell everyone watching, when Paul gave me the privilege to invite me to speak at the Academy in March of 2011, and we spent the whole day together, and following my presentation, a couple of young agents came up to me and said, you said something that was profound, bear with me. They said, I was really surprised to hear you say prison was the easiest part of the process. That doesn't make sense to us. How could standing for count, how could that be easier? And I reminded them, as I remind all of you, and we've addressed it, As Tom Petty said, waiting is the hardest part. That waiting and wondering for 3.5 years, building up in my mind what life would be like, it was very difficult. Getting sentenced was much easier than pleading guilty because in my sentencing I had clarity. And I didn't know all the positives or benefits that it can accompany serving time in prison. And I also told the agent, prison's clearly defined. You have a beginning and an end. Unlike when you're a defendant, you have no idea. So I guess my point is, if you're watching this and you're a defendant, or you're a spouse or a child trying to support your loved one, this is absolutely the hardest part. I absolutely guarantee and promise you, there's no violence in these minimum security camps. Boredom is the highest value. Shawshank Redemption, Cool Hand Luke, those are just movies sensationalized on television. There ain't no violence there, okay? It can be boring or it can be incredibly productive. It can be life-changing. It can be transformational. And I want you to find a mentor. I found Michael Santos. If you'd like our team to be a mentor, we're here. If there's someone else better equipped to try to help guide you, find them, vet them, interview them, but just take action and prioritize your well-being. And I just want to close with what everyone in our team watched your podcast, Paul. I asked them to send thoughts, and all of them responded with what they thought was the most profound thing you said, which was, no one wants to die. They just want the pain to end. Getting the pain end starts with taking action, holding people you hire accountable. And if you've made some bad choices, we're human beings. We can all become better. We can all become better.
Justin, as soon as you take responsibility for what you did, nobody can hold it against you anymore.
I wish I learned that when I interviewed with you. Instead, I spun lies for the next year until I read my name on the cover of the Los Angeles Times. And perhaps we'll cover that in a separate video. Until then, Paul, I'm so grateful that you're a mentor and friend, and it's somewhat surreal to know our journey over 15 years, from arresting me to inviting me to speak to mentoring me and now sharing your insights with everyone who follows our work at White Collar Advisor. Just a personal note, I'm just humbled and so grateful you've taken the time to do this. It means I lack the skills to describe how much I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Okay.